Good afternoon or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I greet you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. My name is Siabulela Tonono. I'm going to be taking you through a bit of history around missionaries and more particularly black missionaries and the role that some of these guys have played in shaping the way we understand the institution called the church and the Methodist Church, to be more precise. Hopefully we'll be able to get some question and answer sessions towards the end of the session, and also just grapple some dialogue around historical issues of the Methodist Church and its complicity or its involvement within the colonial project, and so on and so forth. So, basically that is the whole gist for today's conversation. We'll briefly be looking at three people. And the role that they've played in the development of of Methodism and generally Christianity throughout Southern Africa. Those three people are the lives of William Shaw Kama, Gianniga Chachu or John Chachu, as well as Silas Molema. Now, these are just three random figures within the body of knowledge that we know about Methodism and how it developed. These are just three names which perhaps to many of you don't even make any sense, but these are these people, and we'll be having a brief conversation about them, and I'll hopefully show you some pictures and other things as well. Just before we even get on to our dialogue, there's a myth that I would like to first, or there's an untruth that I would like to first address, and it relates to the idea that the Bible is not African. The Bible is a foreign tool brought to South Africa or to Africa by white people. That is not true. For two reasons. One, when you take the story of Africa out of the Bible, nothing is left for the Jews. So when you take the place of Africa outside of the story of the Bible, there's nothing. So without the Bible, you have no Egypt, and you have no slavery, and you have none of that, because the salvation from slavery is how the Jewish God represented God's self among Jewish people. So when you take Africa out of that narrative, the Jews don't need a God. And further beyond the fact that there's a lot of African people and there's a lot of Africa within the biblical stories themselves. Sheikh Anta Diop, in the 1970s, published a book called The African Origins of Civilization. And in that book, among the things Sheikh Anta Diop does is to touch on how every major world civilization traces its roots to Africa, including Christianity. So when you say that Christianity or the Bible is a foreign tool to Africa, what you are saying is that it came from outside of Africa, whereas fact of the matter is, or at least according to Sheikh Anta Diop's work and a whole host of other scholars who studied this, is that, hang on, the Bible is actually a text of African origins. And aside from Sheikh Anta Diop, people like Matole Motsecha, in a book titled called Mujaji, Principles of Female Headship and African Cosmology, or something along those lines, again stretches the argument made by Diop in just saying that perhaps this idea that we have that the Bible is a foreign tool is actually not true. And of course, within those books, they expand on that idea. And the reason I want to touch on this idea is simply because of one thing. Often when we talk about the growth of Christianity and Christianity in the African context, we always talk about it as though it was something that was enforced upon by whites. Yes, there was some enforcement of their form of Christianity. But fact of the matter is the Christianity and the Christian faith would not be where it is without the agency, without the work of black people. And so the people I'm going to be talking about today are primarily those who were at the forefront of ensuring that Christianity spreads as far and as wide as possible. And these are the people that basically kind of gave structure to the structuralized church, firstly, and also I feel it's very important that we understand that when we're talking about Christianity, we're not talking about a foreign idea, foreign religion. In fact, we're talking about something that many of us understand, and so we are talking about something that many of us even understood before the principle of before introduction into Christianity and so on. But let me not digress. Today I want us to talk about three interesting characters. The first one that I would like to talk about is Jan Chachu, a man born somewhere in the region of King Williamstown in the 19th century, born somewhere around King Williamstown. He's the son of a Ndinde chief, Ukote Chachu, and he was born of Khoi descent, and it said around 1792. Now, let me give you a picture of this man before I continue. Just show you a picture of this guy at a very interesting affair or occasion. The man I'm talking about, Jan Chachu, here is this gentleman over here. And this picture is an image representing the time he went to London, and he went to address the House of Commons in the UK sometime in the 19th century. Now, that's the man we're talking about today, or at least now. Now, Jan Chachu is, as I've mentioned, is possibly one of the most unsung heroes within the Christian faith. At least in the South African context. So he was born around 1792. At the same time, aware of the missionary work of a missionary by the name of Johannes van der Kemp of the London Missionary Society. Van der Kemp had established a mission station around the area that is now known as Port Elizabeth. The name of his mission station was Bethelsdorp. And so Kote Chachu's father decided that, you know what, I'll take my kid to this mission station so that he can get acquainted with knowledge that Westerners have. That's where he learned carpentry, as far as I understand. He learned carpentry and a whole host of other skills that would make him very useful. Now, it is often said that Ukama or Ukama Gachungwa was the first Christian or the first Xhosa chief to proclaim Christianity. It's actually a lie. It's a lie. Uchachu was baptized as far back as about 1816. So yes, what did Chachu do? Now, Chachu's claim to fame is that he was a convert. He was among the first few converts. Now, because of his descent from the area of Amandinde, he was the son of a chief Amandinde. So it made him pretty much aware of the role, the diplomatic role necessary if a missionary is to ask for space within the chief's territory. So it was that kind of what made him beautiful is that he understood the diplomacy of working with chiefs, and that was why missionaries valued him so much, because he could dance to the sort of, he knew what was expected when you are in the presence of royalty, and he knew how to navigate those politics. Now, what happened now in 1816, he then moves, opens up a mission station among Amangqika, that's somewhere around Fort Beaufort, close to Alice. Opens a mission station there, but that mission station didn't last quite long. By about 1812, the ongoing colonial wars that were taking place ravaged the mission station, and that was the end of that. But his two biggest things, in my opinion, one is that this man translated the first gospel into isiXhosa. Something that we don't know of. Do we ever think of him? Anyone into about who knows anything about the translation of the Bible into isiXhosa given to Appleyard, whereas in fact Appleyard was not the guy. He may have been the guy, but was not the guy. So in about 1826 or thereabout, along the banks of the river known as the Buffalo, that is in the Eastern Cape, somewhere around what is today King Williamstown. The town of King Williamstown was actually established by Uchachu. And yes, now fast forward to about 80. He's there with a missionary called Brownlee, and they are working on this translation of the first isiXhosa Bible. And around 26, they finished this first gospel, and it was, I think, the Gospel of Mark. And they continue with this project of translating certain parts of the Bible into isiXhosa. Okay, now, and part of the translations that he makes are the translations that Appleyard, when he published his, close to about 40 years later, when he published his translation of the Bible, which caused a hell of a lot of ruckus among missionary societies, but that's a story for another day. When he does that, Appleyard, in his translation of the Bible, actually relied heavily on much of what was written by Uchachu. Now, Chachu effectively is the man that gave us the Bible in isiXhosa, but no one knows about him. No one knows his story. Further to that, following like around the 1820s again, he had one of the most iconic trips across the Orange River, which was at the time the border for the colony, for the Cape Colony. And he, alongside Reed, another missionary of the London Missionary Society, they started the first mission station among Botswana. So effectively, now it was Uchachu who was the guide and that was assisting Reed in all of this work. On was from Reed's mission work, then came the likes of your Robert Moffat, who's then kind of blew up, if I may use that language, blew up, and much of missionary history around Botswana revolves around him, of course. Now, again, another interesting nugget of fact about Uchachu is that in 1823, when William Shaw wants to open up a mission station among the heathen, and I quote him, which were Amagumkwebe, the person that actually was his guide and translator was Jan Chachu, right? Now, what Chachu, so effectively, if there was no Jan Chachu, there would never have been any chains of stations this guy built, and on and on and on and on. But essentially, the crux of it all is that all of this was done by Jan Chachu. That's the fascinating thing, that we probably don't know that the first translation of the Bible into Xhosa was actually by Jan Chachu, this man who we don't know. And the other aspect is that the first mission station among black people that was open among black people, which were Amagumkwebe, which was Wesleyville in around 1823-4, was open mainly through the work of Jan Chachu. Again. Now let's quickly move on to our second character that I want us to briefly discuss. And the second character I want to briefly discuss is a very interesting character, probably known to many, but just got a picture of him. His name is William Shaw Xandi Kama. William Shaw Xandi Kama. Now, William Shaw Kama was the son of Ukama Gachungwa, the celebrated Gunukwebe chief, who's said to be the first Xhosa chief to publicly proclaim Christianity, which is, again, as I've said before, false, because Chachu owns that title. Now, William Shaw, or Uxandi as I like to call him, Uxandi was the son of Ukama. Ukama was the third, or one of three sons of the chief Uchungwa. Again, now what is fascinating for me about the life story of William Shaw Kama is famous claim, or his claim to fame within Methodist pews, is that he wrote the hymn 206 in his Xhosa. But my understanding of the hymn and my understanding of his life in context is that actually the hymn was more than just a prayer for forgiveness, but it was rather a lamentation for land. If you understand his life in context and you look at the words he wrote, you'd kind of see the parallels, but that's a story for another day. briefly, let me just track his journey. He was raised in a Christian home, raised in the first generation Christian home. He's raised. His father is a sort of a celebrity chief. His father is one of the first few people to proclaim Christianity and say, "Listen, I'm not gonna get. I'm about this Christianity thing, and that's it." One of the requirements for for you to be a prophesying Christian in 19th century South Africa was that you had to be a man of one wife. Now, it's a bit of an interesting one when you take the fact that polygamy was the norm among royal houses. Firstly, because they were wealthy enough to afford polygamy. Secondly, polygamy was also a way in which different nations, tribes, whatever you want to call them, that's how they solidified their ranks, and that's how they solidified their relations with one another. I mean, if you're married to one of my daughters, surely your people are not going to come in and invade me, and we're not going to have war. So that idea of creating linkages around family was the idea behind polygamy. And Uchachu, one of the things that made him unpopular with his brothers was that he said, nope, he will only be a man of one wife. Now, in a context where others in a context where other institution of polygamous marriages for the purpose of ensuring that you've got stronger relations with your neighbors, that is kind of a big problem for Ahmad Qunqwebe, because to reject a bride was akin to starting a war, effectively. So when this guy, because of his Christianity, says, no, I'm not doing this thing, effectively what he does to his nation and his people is that he opens them up to become basically anyone who's willing to fight with them will fight with them, because of the sort of the diplomatic issues around the marriage of a chief, right? Now, Ukama was born eTwecu, which is somewhere around Wesleyville. In the 1820s or 30s, we're not quite sure. He then moves to Salem, which is somewhere on the western side of Grahamstown, and he's taught there at a place called the Watson Institute. And the Watson Institute was really the Methodist Church's first attempt at trying to create schoolmasters, to train teachers and native missionaries, so as to be able to assist Wesleyan missionaries. Not a problem. Now he's training there. His father has moved away, has broken a bit of rank with his other brothers, and he opens up a station in Newtondale that is somewhere around in about 1836. Newtondale is in the vicinity of Pedi, so that's between King Williamstown and Grahamstown, right? Now, with that being said, interestingly, and then about 1842, Ukama gets a deal from Mushweshwe that there's a tract of land. He's trying to get away from his brothers. That there's a tract of land somewhere along the banks of the Orange River. If he comes to it, they'll negotiate and then fine, no problem. Turns out that didn't quite turn out that way. Unfortunately, it was an ambush attack. Ahmad Qunqwebe were attacked, but they ran to the safety of a Wesleyan missionary again, William Shepstone, not to be confused with Shepstone. So William Shepstone, and then at the time the War of 1846 starts, and he gets involved in that war. And first of all, the first reward of being involved in that war, he gets, he gets a tract of land known as Kama Stone. Now, the name Kama Stone is basically made up of Kama, from, yes, Kama himself, and then stone, Shepstone. So it's just a combination of those two words to give you Kama Stone. But he didn't spend much time in Kama Stone, because in 1853 he left Kama Stone and then established himself at Xesi, or Middledrift, somewhere between Alice and King Williamstown. Fair enough. He establishes himself there because he had been a British ally against Abatembu. He had been a British ally against a number of people. So he's been an ally for Amangesi on a number of occasions, and he gets his tract of land. But that's the interesting thing. Now, a few years down the line, what then transpires is that the very same British government that has given him this tract of land along the Kaiskama and the Kume rivers goes on and wants to sell his own land, the very land that they'd given to him as a reward. And then, of course, he gets into some protests. He tries to fight that off, and. But basically, when you read his hymn, in light of all his up and down journeys looking for a place to call home, and the place where he eventually settled in, Ukama is really one of those stories that kind of tell the story of how, no matter how much you want to integrate into white culture, into white society, into the colonialist hierarchy, no matter how much you want to, there's just not a place for black people in that space. And even though these people, I mean, both Kama and both Uchachu were somewhat British allies, and they were allies in English. But unfortunately, when it came to colonial dispossession, they were just as dispossessed, just like any other black people. So it's quite interesting to see how these kind of play out in the stories of these people's lives. And then so when you look at Kama's life, my parting shot on Kama, when you look at his life and understand it in context, and you look at his Diakala Gwenkosi Bao Ingcele Ndive, you'll understand that that's basically the prayer of a homeless man who has no land. That is the prayer of a homeless man who does not know where home is, because there's this rift between his family. He's been moving from pillar to post. Moved from Tuegu to Newtondale, from Newtondale to Kama Stone, from Kama Stone back to Xesi, where they kind of find some normalcy. And in the midst of that, boom, his land, or the only place he's kind of developed as a home, is now up for sale, but at the hands of colonialist, at the helm of colonialist officials, and so that was the interesting thing about Ukama. Now, the last of my three chiefs that I want to talk about is that of Silas Molema. Now, Silas Molema, born and raised, is of Barolong stock, if I may use that word. So, as they always say, the story of Methodist missions is Methodist missions among Botswana. It's really a story of Methodist missions among Barolong, because other missionary institutions were busy with other tribes or with other nations of the Botswana kingdom. So Silas Molema is the grandson of the great Molema. Now, Molema, the great chief Molema, is the founding father of the place called what's this? Mahikeng. But there are controversies around whether did he start the settlement or what was the situation there. Others are saying Molema went there to so that he could express his Christianity, so that he could be Christian as far as he wanted. And others are saying that no, his older brother had given him that piece of land to say, listen, protect this land just in case. But there are interesting dynamics around that. Now he gets to Mahikeng, stays in Mahikeng. He's educated at Hilltown, by the way. So from the northern end of South Africa to the sort of southeastern end of South Africa. That's where he got his schooling from. He was trained as a teacher and became a businessman, a very wealthy businessman, with quite significant amounts of land at his disposal. Yes. One of the interesting things he's done, Molema, is that if you remember, Saul Plaiki once had a newspaper called the Kuranta ya Batswana, which was basically, it was to Tswana people what Izimvo was to Xhosa people, or Ilanga was to Zulu people. So it was a publication that was mainly targeting Tswana. And yes, now one of the backers for that project, Kaplaki, was actually Silas Molema. Now again, if you browse through your Setswana hymn book, you'll find a number of hymns written by Molema. It's always coded as STS. So when a hymn has the alphabets STS in brackets in the Setswana hymn book, it is authored by, I think he wrote about something like 8 to 10, I'm not quite sure. I'll check out the specifics later. But ultimately, now fast forward, in the 18th, so towards the 19th century, here is a man, the most funniest thing for me is that if you remember the Jameson raid, where Cecil John Rhodes and them tried to take over Gauteng, or tried to take over Johannesburg because they wanted their fingers in that mud cake, or in that money cake called Gauteng. The operatives for the Jameson raid were trained on Silas Molema's farm. Benefits that Molema was expecting, that should this thing cash in, should the Jameson raid happen the way they had anticipated, once they get control of basically the what's this, Gauteng, then effectively Molema would also get some kickbacks, if I may so use that word. But unfortunately, the Jameson raid never happened, and unfortunately, but long story short, on the Anglo-Boer War, during the Anglo-Boer War, Molema was leading a platoon of Barolong soldiers, warriors, and they were defending Mahikeng like it's nobody's business. But unfortunately, he was on the wrong side of history. But following the Anglo-Boer War, he lost all his properties. His friend had died, Cecil John Rhodes. His friend had died. He lost most of his properties, and basically, it sums up the story of black people trying to assimilate to the white Western world, in the sense that in all these three gentlemen that I've talked about, all of them had an aspiration and wanted to fit into that world, into that world view. At the table for black people, if there is any. Fact of the matter is, coloniality or colonialism will always remind you of your outcast nature. And one will either erase you from history, that nothing is ever said about you, or you will just cease to exist. So it's very important that the stories of people like Kama, the stories of people like Mulema, the stories of people like Chachu continue. The Christianity that we see here today, we've been as black people, we've been a fundamental part of making sure that it is what it is today. So it's very important that we take these conversations about our own histories and engage with them and write them, read them, engage with them from our own vantage point as black people, because effectively, if we look through the history pages, it is as if we don't exist as black people. But the fact of the matter is, these institutions were built on the blood, sweat, and pockets of our people. So we at all times must always make sure that the story of black people and black missionaries is always one that is being told. And on that point, are there any questions? I'll take the comments and questions next 2 minutes. So if you can type very quickly and finish your question very quickly, then then we can deliberate on that. I'm also reading through all the other ones and trying to, yes. Okay. Is it fine to assume that there are no questions? Because I don't see any questions popping up. But on that note, I'd like to thank you very much. If there are no questions, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. Before I shut down, let me just give a number of plugs to read some of the books I read. One of the books, firstly, is a book by Roger Levine titled "A Living Man from Africa," Jan Chachu. It's a 2000 publication by Yale University Press. The author is Roger Levine, titled "A Living Man from Africa," published in 2000. The other publication I'd really like to give a shout out to is a book it's a thesis by Siziwe Drusilla Yekela, titled "The Life and Times of Kama Kachungwa, 1798 to 1875." And the other book that I would like to read is by Brian Weiland, the autobiography of Saul Blakey. Those are some of the 3 books that I've come across, and of course a whole host of other historical material. I'm not going to bore you with that stuff. Yes. Damien, you have a question. Please do pose that question. I'll answer the question right now by Uqesibe Lungsile Akona Chai. And while you type your question. The question is, would you compare the Mandela chiefdom and Kama chiefdom to be similar, seeing that they were not heirs to the throne? Would I compare them? Okay. Interestingly enough, I won't lie, I'm not very much well versed into Abatembu and lineage yabo. But what I do know is that one, ukama okanye lama gqunkhwe basexesi to this present day, obabukumkani bupha is not in its entirety. It was just ubukumkani bamagqunkhwebe that those left and decided, Bona, they want to chart a new path. Ultimately, in 1853, they were settled there. But ubukumkani bamagqunukhwebe as amagqunukhwebe uyawuva xa wethetha banento ethi kukho amagqunukhwebe aselwandle, meaning those ones closer to the sea. And there's a kind of a general understanding among amagqunukhwebe that amagqunukhwebe aselwandle are the more senior houses. But unfortunately, when it comes to the colonial wars of resistance, it all boiled down to who did you back? If you back the colonialists, they'll give you land, which is one of the reasons why most chose to kind of associate themselves with missionaries, which was the value of settlement to begin with, is the fact that you could engage with the colony on a bit of a more equal footing. You could engage. Having a missionary within your location kind of opened up a number of opportunities for you within the white world, as it were. So I wouldn't quite say it's Ukama is not an heir to Bukhosi Bamagqunukhwebe nango lwesingaphi na, and that is a fact. And I think it's one of the reasons the commission recently I think in the early 2000s it did a study of houses in South Africa and said who's legitimate and who's not. Yeah, again, so around there where you can't just make out simplistic kind of views like that. But of course, one would say because they kind of sided with the white people and they sided with the colonialists. So yeah, it kind of dents their credibility as revolutionary heroes, I guess. Okay, some interesting questions. Let me get this in the question from Sibabalo Mlungisi. Besides the translation of the gospel to isiXhosa by church, what significant hermeneutical contribution did these first Methodists make to the black church? Wow. Yeah. I think again, I'll see. I'm not a theologian, therefore the hermeneutics and those technicalities, I'll leave those for those who are well versed in that. I'm primarily a person who is interested in history and people's stories. For me, the greatest significant contribution these people made is that they asserted themselves. In an that said they do not exist, they are not people, they are half monkeys, they are all of these people. And of course, people who were, for a period of about 11 years, Amagqunukhwebe in their travels across the Eastern Cape were without, right? Even in Newtondale, the station that was opened for Ukama was the one person with his sons, Ukhandi no Samuel. They were the people who made sure that every Sunday there's a Sunday service going on. They were the people who made sure that every Sunday ngeni nkonzo. And that for me is kind of is the significant contribution is that at a time when no one could take the gospel to the spaces that the gospel could be taken to by these people, they just said, we'll go on about our business. We're not interested in off the religion. We're not gonna wait for the missionary society to send a missionary amongst us. For a period of 11 years, Ukama led his own church. The same story goes with the The same story goes with Molema. The same story goes with Uchachu. Again, all of the contribution, firstly, is the fact that there's a lot of work that they have done which has gone unnoticed. And perhaps the time is now to say, okay, let's bring these narratives back to the fore. And so that for me is the biggest contribution they've made in trying to, last two questions. From the one from Damien O'Grady and the last one from Ngaba Vagaza. How do or should the stories, ministries, and lived experiences of these black missionaries inform the shape of the ministry in the contemporary MCSA? How do their challenges speak into the challenges of ministering into a post-apartheid era where we know that structural racism still exists? Damien, that's another can of worms. Effectively, what I think for me, the thing when reading through these life stories is that all of these people's stories tell one thing about Methodism, that it is fundamentally entrenched in colonialist racist thinking. And the structures that set up the institution we have now, so from your Grahamstown, from all these talks about different synods, your Grahamstown synods, your Clarkbury synods, and right down to the names of our churches in the rural of Eastern Capes, a place like Newtondale. These are all named after Englishmen who were serving the British Methodist Church at the time. Hilltown was named after its benefactor. So it's all these, and what the story says is it shows how intricately tied the institution is to oppression. Point out, we still live in that colonial oppression, which is what some will call coloniality, as opposed to colonialism. Now, colonialism being the structure, the kind of a government having a permanent sort of structure in some foreign land somewhere. But coloniality is the idea that the ties that bind between the colonial master and the colonial servant still exist. Not exist in the ways that they existed before in historical colonialism. So what actually mean, or what these stories mean, is that one, we have to fundamentally look at our structures and look at how racist colonial ideologies have shaped how we are. I mean, a typical example, there's this thing within the Methodist Church. There was a policy which dates back named as heathen's policy. Basically, it regulated how a minister is to intervene in situations where the child is from a non-Christian household, but the parents are Christian. The parents are not Christian, but the child wants to be part of Sunday school. Can this child be allowed? And Heathens and Customs policy says, nope, you're not allowed there. If you go to the mount, if you go for circumcision, as per your rite of passage, you're not allowed to enter schools whatsoever. And these are policies that have been, that Heathen's policy was only removed from official statutes as late as 1991. So it tells you that the colonialism continues and continues to manifest itself. And what the stories of these men show us is that we need to critically look at how we understand, how our structures and all these other aspects of our life and of being church are fundamentally shaped by colonialist structures. And if we are really interested in this business of being what's this? Of being a I forgot. Christ healed Africa. Now, if we are really serious about that, and we are serious about placing Africa in the front, in the foretext of all that we do, then we need to be critical about how we engage with ourselves. And the last question. Have we completely lost our African ways of worshipping? Yeah, no. You see, that is a difficult question for me to answer for two reasons. Like I said, I'm a historian. I like stories of history. African worship and all those, I think there are people who write about that and whose space that is. And I think I would be exceeding my bounds to answer that question about what African worship is, because it's a very open-ended question. Which Africa are you talking about? Do you include forms of African worship that have been influenced by colonialism and its impact with colonial society? So there are a whole lot of questions that question just in and of itself kind of underlines. But like I said, the book by who's this? Mathole Motshekga, the Modjadji, Queen Modjadji, Principles of Female Headship in Africa, or something along those lines. That's the title. That book actually delves also gets and dwells into and there are a number of authors who've kind of gone into that space of African worship and what it means, what it is. So I honestly don't think I'm well suited, qualified, well versed, knowledgeable, whatever word you want to use, to answer that question. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It has been a pleasure. Let's keep this conversation going. On my Facebook post, I generally comment, I generally share this kind of information. Feel free to send a friend request. I'll respond to that. Feel at siabulela.donon@gmail.com, where we can share some interesting facts and little figures about history. That's what I'm about. And enjoy the rest of your night, and take care and keep safe.